The voice of justice. The morning air in Los Angeles hung heavy with smog and promise as Elena Rodriguez parked her weathered Honda Civic in the courthouse parking lot. She sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes closed, breathing slowly, in, out. The technique her speech therapist had taught her 20 years ago still served as her anchor in moments of anxiety. "You are enough," she whispered to herself. "Your voice matters." She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, professional and severe. Her makeup was minimal, just enough to hide the shadows under her eyes from another night of preparation. The navy blue pantsuit she wore was her armor, slightly worn at the cuffs but impeccably pressed. At 34, Elena had learned that appearance mattered in courtrooms, especially for women like her. Gathering her briefcase and the stack of files she'd prepared until 3 a.m., she stepped out of her car. The Los Angeles County Courthouse loomed before her, a monument of limestone and authority. She'd walked these steps hundreds of times in her 8 years as an attorney, but today felt different. Today, everything was at stake. Elena had built her career defending immigrants facing deportation, often working pro bono when clients couldn't pay. It wasn't lucrative, but it mattered. Each family kept together was a victory that sustained her through the defeats, which came more frequently than she cared to admit. But the Martinez case was different. Maria Martinez and her 7-year-old son Diego had fled Guatemala after her husband, a journalist who exposed government corruption, was murdered. Their asylum case should have been straightforward. Instead, they'd been caught in a labyrinth of bureaucratic cruelty, their case deliberately stalled by a system that seemed designed to break their spirit. After 2 years of fighting, Elena had finally secured a hearing before Judge Richard Blackwell. The mere thought of his name made her jaw clench. Blackwell was known for his harsh stance on immigration cases and his thinly veiled contempt for attorneys like her. Bleeding hearts, he called them, when he was being polite. As she climbed the courthouse steps, Elena felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. Checking the screen, she saw a message from her producer, Jordan. "Podcast downloads hit 1 million. People want more Justice J. When's the next episode dropping?" A small smile crossed her face. No one in this courthouse knew that mild-mannered Elena Rodriguez, who sometimes stumbled over her words when nervous, was also the anonymous voice behind The Scales of Injustice, a wildly popular podcast that exposed corruption in the American judicial system. As Justice J, her voice never wavered, never stuttered. She spoke with an authority she rarely felt in her daily life, protected by anonymity and armed with meticulous research. Her latest investigation had focused on judicial misconduct in immigration courts, with a particular interest in one Judge Richard Blackwell. For 6 months, she'd been gathering evidence, interviews, and data. The episode was nearly ready, but she needed more concrete proof of his bias, his abuse of power, his disregard for the law he claimed to uphold. Elena tucked her phone away without responding. Jordan would have to wait. Today, she needed to be fully present as Elena Rodriguez, attorney at law, advocate for the Martinez family. Justice J would have to wait. As she passed through security, nodding to the guards who recognized her as a regular, Elena mentally rehearsed her opening statement. The facts were on her side. The law was on her side. But in Blackwell's courtroom, that wasn't always enough. She found Maria and Diego waiting on a bench outside the courtroom, Maria's face tight with worry, Diego clutching a small action figure in his hand. When they saw her, Diego ran forward. "Miss Elena!" "Look, I brought Superman. Mom says he fights for justice like you." Elena knelt down to his level, smiling. "That's right, Diego. And today we're going to fight for justice together, okay?" The boy nodded solemnly, then Elena felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She couldn't fail them. Not today, not with so much at stake. As they entered courtroom 7B, Elena scanned the room. It was smaller than she'd expected, with dark wood paneling that absorbed the light from the high windows. The government attorney, Thomas Reed, was already at his table, arranging papers with military precision. He didn't look up when they entered. Elena guided Maria and Diego to their seats at the defense table, arranging her materials and trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. The courtroom was nearly empty. Immigration hearings rarely drew spectators, but Elena noticed a young woman with a notebook in the back row, probably a law student observing proceedings. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the bailiff called out, "All rise!" The Honorable Judge Richard Blackwell presiding. The door behind the bench opened and Judge Blackwell entered. At 62, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a full head of silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never had his authority questioned, who had never stood where Elena stood now, fighting for someone else's future with the odds stacked against them. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice echoing in the quiet room. As he adjusted his robes and settled into his chair, his gaze swept the courtroom, pausing briefly on Elena and her clients. Something in his expression hardened so subtly that someone who hadn't studied him as carefully as she had might have missed it. Case number 8072-349 Martinez et al. Versus Department of Homeland Security, he announced, glancing at the file before him. "Counsel, identify yourselves for the record." Thomas Reed stood first. "Thomas Reed for the government, Your Honor." Elena rose, smoothing her jacket. "Elena Rodriguez for the petitioners, Your Honor." Blackwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ms. Rodriguez, I see you're still taking on these youth cases." The pause was deliberate, the slight emphasis an insult. Elena felt her pulse quicken but kept her expression neutral. "It's my duty to ensure all people have access to justice, Your Honor," she replied evenly. "Justice," he repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. "Well, let's proceed. Mr. Reed, your opening statement." As Reed launched into the government's position, that Maria Martinez's claim of persecution was unsubstantiated, that her husband's death was likely criminal rather than political, that she and her son were economic migrants rather than refugees. Elena watched Blackwell. He nodded occasionally, his expression attentive and respectful. When it was Elena's turn, she stood centering herself before speaking. She'd prepared meticulously, knew the facts cold, had rehearsed her argument until she could deliver it in her sleep. But standing before Blackwell, feeling his dismissive gaze, she felt the old familiar tightness in her throat. "Your Honor," she began, "Maria and Diego Martinez have endured unimaginable tragedy." The slight stutter on the word, tragedy, was barely noticeable, but Elena felt it like a physical blow. She paused, took a breath, and continued. "After Joaquin Martinez was murdered for exposing government corruption, Maria received death threats. The Guatemalan police refused to investigate her husband's murder. She fled with her son, seeking not economic opportunity, but survival." The stutter was becoming more pronounced. Elena could feel Blackwell's eyes on her, see the slight curl of his lip. She forced herself to continue, outlining the documented evidence of persecution, citing relevant case law, building the irrefutable case for asylum. But Blackwell wasn't listening. He sighed audibly, checked his watch, shuffled papers. His contempt was palpable, designed to throw her off balance, and it was working. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Elena said, approaching a critical point in her argument, "the Department of State's own Human Rights Report C confirmed that journalists and their families face Ms. Rodriguez." Blackwell interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "Do you require assistance forming complete sentences? Perhaps we should recess until you can collect yourself." The courtroom fell silent. Elena felt heat rise to her face, felt Maria's frightened gaze, felt the weight of Diego's future in her suddenly trembling hands. "I apologize, Your Honor," she managed, her voice strained but stable. "As I was saying, the department's reports confirm. What they confirm is, Rodriguez, is that the United States cannot be responsible for every person facing difficulties in their home country." Blackwell cut in again. "Your clients, like many others, seek to circumvent our immigration laws under the guise of asylum. I'm familiar with these tactics." Elena's fingers gripped the edge of the table. "With all due respect, Your Honor, asylum is not a tactic. It's a legal right recognized by both U.S. and international law." Blackwell leaned forward, his expression darkening. "Are you presuming to lecture me on the law, Ms. Rodriguez?" "No, Your Honor. Because I assure you, I don't need lessons from an attorney who can barely articulate her arguments." The comment landed like a physical blow. Elena heard a small gasp from Maria beside her. In the back of the courtroom, the young woman with the notebook looked up, eyes wide. "Your Honor," Elena said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I request that you focus on the merits of this case rather than personal remarks about counsel." Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Request denied, Ms. Rodriguez. This is my courtroom, and I will conduct it as I see fit. Now, if you're quite finished stumbling through your statement, I'd like to hear from the actual parties involved." He turned to Maria. "Mrs. Martinez, stand up." Maria rose slowly, her small frame tense with fear. Diego clutched her hand, his superhero figure forgotten on the table. "Mrs. Martinez," Blackwell said, his tone suddenly gentle, reasonable, "I understand you've had difficulties, but I need to determine if they rise to the legal standard for asylum. So tell me, why can't you simply relocate to another part of Guatemala?" Before Maria could answer, Elena interjected, "Your Honor, my client has already explained in her affidavit that the threats followed her to 3 different cities. The men who killed her husband have connections throughout the country." Blackwell's gaze snapped back to Elena, all pretense of gentleness gone. Ms. Rodriguez, if I want your input, I will ask for it. You are not to interrupt while I'm questioning your client. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, but... Eyes. That, clear. Each word was a hammer blow. Elena swallowed hard. Yes, Your Honor. Good. Now, Mrs. Martinez, please answer the question. Maria began to speak in halting English, explaining how the death threats had followed her, how the police had laughed when she sought help, how her brother-in-law had been beaten after asking too many questions about Joaquin's death. As she spoke, Blackwell's expression grew increasingly skeptical. He interrupted frequently, asking questions designed to confuse and contradict. When Maria's English faltered, he grew impatient, refusing Elena's request to use the court interpreter. If she wants to live in this country, she should speak its language, he remarked. By the time he finished questioning Maria, the woman was visibly shaken, her testimony fragmented by his interruptions in her own limited English. Diego had shrunk in his seat, the child's earlier confidence replaced by fear. I've heard enough, Blackwell announced. Well, take a brief recess, and then I'll hear witness testimony. As he stood to leave, his gaze lingered on Elena, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He knew what he was doing, knew exactly how to undermine her, to make her clients doubt her, to inject his prejudice into the proceedings under the guise of judicial authority. The bailiff called out, "All rise," and everyone stood as Blackwell exited. As soon as the door closed behind him, Elena turned to Maria, speaking rapidly in Spanish to reassure her, to explain what would happen next, to apologize for Blackwell's behavior. Why does he hate us? Diego asked suddenly, his small voice cutting through Elena's explanations. Elena fell silent, unsure how to answer. How do you explain systemic injustice to a 7-year-old? How do you tell him that the person charged with deciding his fate had likely made up his mind before ever hearing a word of testimony? He doesn't hate you, Diego, she said finally, kneeling to meet his eyes. He just doesn't understand your story yet. That's my job, to help him understand. The boy looked unconvinced, but nodded. Elena straightened up, noticing the young woman from the back row approaching hesitantly. Excuse me, Ms. Rodriguez. I just wanted to say, that was really inappropriate what he said to you, about your speech. I'm a law student, and I've been observing different courtrooms, and I've never seen a judge speak to an attorney like that. Thank you, Elena said, surprised by the young woman's boldness. What's your name? Zoe Williams. I'm at UCLA Law. Elena managed a smile. Well, Zoe Williams from UCLA Law, unfortunately, what you witnessed isn't as uncommon as we'd like to think, especially in these cases. Zoe's expression was troubled. Is there anything that can be done? Can you report him or something? Elena thought of the half-finished podcast episode on her computer, the evidence she'd been compiling against Blackwell. There are channels, she said carefully, but they're often ineffective. Judicial misconduct is challenging to address. It's just wrong. Zoe said, her youthful indignation both touching and familiar. The way he's treating you, the way he's treating your clients. It's not justice. No, Elena agreed quietly. It's not. She glanced at her watch. You should take your seat. He'll be back soon, and he doesn't like disruptions. As Zoe returned to her seat, Elena took a moment to collect herself. The morning had gone even worse than she'd anticipated. Blackwell wasn't just biased, he was openly hostile. He had deliberately triggered her stutter, used her momentary speech difficulty to undermine her credibility, and was systematically dismantling her case not on legal grounds, but personal ones. She felt a familiar anger building inside her. The same righteous fury that had driven her to create the Justice J persona, to launch her podcast, to spend countless hours documenting judicial abuses of power. But anger wouldn't help Maria and Diego. She needed to remain calm, focused, professional. The door to the judge's chambers opened and Blackwell returned. Everyone rose as he took his seat. Ms. Rodriguez, he said without preamble, call your first witness. Elena nodded, steeling herself for the battle ahead. Whatever Blackwell threw at her, she would endure it. She had no choice, not when the stakes were so high. The defense calls Dr. Luis Vega, she announced, her voice clear and strong. As her expert witness took the stand, Elena squared her shoulders and prepared to fight. Not just for Maria and Diego, but for every client who had ever stood before a judge like Blackwell, powerless against the weight of his prejudice and the authority of his position. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was that this case would become the catalyst for a reckoning long overdue, and that by the time it was over, neither she nor Judge Richard Blackwell would ever be the same. Dr. Luis Vega approached the witness stand with quiet dignity, his silver, streaked dark hair and wire, rimmed glasses giving him the appearance of a distinguished academic, which, in fact, he was. A professor of political science specializing in Latin American governance and a former consultant to human rights organizations, Dr. Vega had testified in dozens of asylum cases. Elena had worked with him before and respected his thorough, measured approach. After he was sworn in, Elena established his credentials, submitting his resume as evidence. Throughout this preliminary questioning, Blackwell appeared almost bored, examining his fingernails and occasionally making notes. Dr. Vega, Elena began. Could you please explain to the court the current political situation in Guatemala as it pertains to journalists and those who speak out against government corruption? Dr. Vega nodded, leaning slightly toward the microphone. Guatemala has one of the highest rates of violence against journalists in the Western Hemisphere. In the past 5 years alone, 17 journalists have been murdered for their reporting on corruption and organized crime. These crimes are rarely investigated, much less prosecuted. And how does this relate to the Martinez case specifically? Joaquin Martinez was investigating links between government officials and drug cartels. His articles had named specific officials, including a regional governor and 2 high-ranking police commanders. Based on my review of the death threats received by Mrs. Martinez after her husband's murder, there is a clear connection between his work and the danger his family faced. Elena nodded, building her case methodically. In your expert opinion, could Mrs. Martinez and her son reasonably expect protection from Guatemalan authorities? Objection, Reed interjected. Calls for speculation. Your Honor, Elena countered. Vega is qualified to assess institutional responses based on documented patterns. This is precisely why expert testimony is relevant in asylum cases. Blackwell's mouth tightened. I'll allow it, but be careful. Rodriguez. Dr. Vega, you may answer. Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Vega said. Based on the documented complicity of local police in similar cases and the specific circumstances where Mrs. Martinez was turned away from 3 different police stations when attempting to report threats, it is my professional opinion that she could not reasonably expect protection. In fact, seeking police help likely increased the danger to her and her son. Elena continued her examination, guiding Dr. Vega through a detailed analysis of the political climate, the specific threats faced by the Martinez family, and the impossibility of internal relocation. Throughout, she was careful to maintain a measured pace, focusing on each word to prevent her stutter from returning. As Dr. Vega spoke, Elena noticed Blackwell becoming increasingly agitated. He shifted in his seat, sighing audibly, interrupting with trivial questions that seemed designed to derail the testimony rather than clarify it. Finally, as Dr. Vega was explaining the pattern of targeted violence against journalists' families, Blackwell cut in sharply. Dr. Vega, we all appreciate your academic perspective, but let's be practical here. Guatemala is a democracy with functioning institutions. Are you suggesting that an entire country of 16 million people is unsafe for the respondents? Not for everyone, Your Honor. Dr. Vega replied carefully, but for a family specifically targeted due to a journalist's work exposing corruption at high levels of government. Yes, I am stating that Guatemala cannot provide adequate protection. Blackwell leaned forward. And how many of these cases have you testified in, Dr. Vega? Approximately 35 over the past decade. And how many of those cases involve claims from Guatemala? I believe 12, Your Honor. 12. Blackwell's voice dripped with skepticism. So you've essentially made a career out of testifying that Guatemala is unsafe. One might question your objectivity, don't you think? Elena stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. Dr. Vega's credibility is not in question. His analysis is based on documented facts, not personal bias. I'll determine what's in question in my courtroom. Ms. Rodriguez. Blackwell snapped. Objection overruled. Dr. Vega, please answer. Dr. Vega met Blackwell's gaze steadily. Your Honor, I base my testimony on factual evidence, not predetermined conclusions. In some cases, I have testified that individuals did not have valid asylum claims. My concern is with accuracy, not advocacy. How convenient. Blackwell muttered just loudly enough to be heard. Continue, Ms. Rodriguez, but let's try to move this along. I have other cases on my docket today. Elena felt her anger rising but forced herself to remain focused. She led Dr. Vega through the remainder of his testimony, establishing the legal grounds for the Martinez asylum claim. By the time she finished her direct examination, even Reed looked uncomfortable with Blackwell's obvious bias. Cross-examination, Mr. Reed. Blackwell asked. Reed rose, straightening his tie. Yes, Your Honor. He approached the witness stand with a deliberate pace. Dr. Vega, isn't it true that thousands of Guatemalans live their lives without experiencing the kind of violence you've described? Yes, of course. Dr. Vega acknowledged. But context-specific risk is what matters in asylum cases. The Martinez family was at risk because of Joaquin Martinez's work, not because of general conditions. Reed nodded, proceeding with a series of questions that, while challenging, remained professional and focused on legitimate legal issues. Elena watched carefully, ready to object if necessary, but Reed's cross-examination was fair, in stark contrast to Blackwell's behavior. When Reed finished, Blackwell looked disappointed, as if he'd hoped for a more aggressive dismantling of Dr. Vega's testimony. "Any redirect, Ms. Rodriguez. Just one question." "Your Honor," Elena said, rising. "Dr. Vega, based on all the evidence you've reviewed, do Maria and Diego Martinez meet the legal standard for asylum under U.S. law?" "Objection," Reed said. "Calls for a legal conclusion. I'm asking for his expert opinion based on his knowledge of the factual circumstances." Elena countered. Blackwell frowned. "I'll allow it, but I remind you, Dr. Vega, that I will make the ultimate determination on this matter." Dr. Vega nodded. "I understand, Your Honor. In my professional opinion, based on the evidence, the Martinez family has a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their family membership and imputed political opinion. They meet the legal standard for asylum." "Thank you, Dr. Vega," Elena said. No further questions. As Dr. Vega stepped down, Elena called her next witness, a former colleague of Joaquin Martinez who had received political asylum 2 years earlier. His testimony was powerful, detailing the dangerous environment for journalists and the specific threats the Martinez family had faced. Throughout the morning, the pattern continued. Elena presented compelling evidence. Blackwell dismissed or undermined it, and the gulf between legal standards and Blackwell's apparent predetermined conclusion widened. By the time the lunch recess was called, Elena was exhausted from the constant effort to maintain her composure in the face of Blackwell's hostility. As the judge left the courtroom, Elena turned to Maria. "You're doing great," she assured her client in Spanish. "The testimony is strong even if the judge is being difficult." Maria's eyes were troubled. "He's going to say no, isn't he? He's going to send us back." Elena wanted to offer reassurance, but she couldn't bring herself to lie. "It's challenging," she admitted. "But we're building a strong record, and that's important. If we need to appeal." Maria's voice cracked. "That could take years." "We don't have years, Elena. The men who killed Joaquin, they don't forget. They won't wait for the American courts to make up their minds." The desperation in Maria's voice cut Elena to the core. This wasn't just a legal case, it was a matter of life and death, and Blackwell was treating it like an inconvenience, an interruption to his day. "I understand," Elena said softly. "Let me think. We still have the afternoon session. Maybe." She was interrupted by Zoe, the law student, approaching hesitantly. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm sorry to bother you, but I recorded some of what happened this morning, on my phone. The way Judge Blackwell spoke to you, how he treated your expert witness, it was really inappropriate. I thought maybe you could use it if you wanted to file a complaint or something." Elena stared at the young woman, surprised by her initiative. "You recorded the proceedings. Zoe, that's against court rules. You could get in trouble." Zoe bit her lip. "I know. But what he's doing is wrong. Someone needs to document it." The words hit Elena like a revelation. Document it. Isn't that exactly what she'd been trying to do with her podcast? Gather evidence, create a record, expose the truth. "Zoo," she said slowly, "thank you for your concern. But I can't accept a recording made against court rules. It could compromise the case." The young woman's face fell. "I understand. I just wanted to help." "Your willingness to speak up helps more than you know," Elena assured her. "The fact that you recognize the injustice happening here, that matters." After Zoe walked away, Elena checked her watch. She had 45 minutes before the afternoon session began. Telling Maria she needed to review some documents, she headed to a quiet corner of the courthouse lobby, pulled out her phone, and called Jordan. "Elena, finally, I've been trying to reach you. We need to talk about the next episode." "Jordan, listen," Elena cut in, keeping her voice low. "I need you to move up the timeline on the Blackwell piece." "What? Why? You said you wanted to gather more evidence, make sure everything was airtight." "Things have changed. I'm in his courtroom right now, representing an asylum case, and it's worse than I thought. He's not even pretending to be impartial. He's openly hostile, dismissive, prejudiced." Jordan was silent for a moment. "Elena, are you sure about this? Moving up the episode means going public with what we have now. If it's not enough, it has to be enough," Elena insisted. "There's a family's life at stake, and not just them. How many other cases has he handled this way? How many lives has he ruined because no one was willing to challenge him?" "Okay," Jordan said finally. I'll start production tonight. But Elena, be careful. If Blackwell finds out it's you behind the podcast, you won't, Elena said more confidently than she felt. Just get it ready. I'll send you the additional audio I recorded yesterday when court ends today. After ending the call, Elena sat for a moment, her mind racing. What she was doing was risky. If her identity as Justice J was revealed, there could be professional consequences. But watching Blackwell abuse his power, watching him dismiss Maria's very real fear, watching him use Elena's occasional stutter to undermine her, it was more than she could bear in silence. The afternoon session would be difficult. Blackwell would continue his pattern of hostility. But now, Elena had a plan. It wasn't just about winning this case anymore, though she would fight with everything she had for Maria and Diego. It was about exposing a system that allowed men like Blackwell to wield their power like a weapon, crushing those who came before them seeking nothing but justice. As she gathered her materials and headed back to the courtroom, Elena felt a strange calm settle over her. The path forward was clear now. Blackwell thought he held all the power in his courtroom. But soon, very soon, he would discover just how wrong he was. The afternoon session began with a subtle but noticeable shift in Elena's demeanor. If Blackwell had expected her to remain cowed by his morning performance, he was mistaken. She stood straighter, spoke more confidently, and met his gaze without flinching. Each time he attempted to interrupt or undermine her, she firmly but respectfully held her ground. "Your Honor," she said at one point, after Blackwell had dismissed a piece of documentary evidence without proper consideration, "I must respectfully insist that this report be entered into the record. It directly corroborates my client's testimony regarding the threats she received." Blackwell's eyebrows rose at her tone. "You insist, Ms. Rodriguez?" "Yes, Your Honor," Elena replied steadily. "It's crucial evidence, and its exclusion would be grounds for appeal." A flicker of something, annoyance, respect, surprise, crossed Blackwell's face before he waved a hand dismissively. "Fine. Enter it into the record, though I fail to see how another piece of paper changes the fundamental weaknesses in your case." Elena didn't rise to the bait. "Thank you, Your Honor." As the afternoon progressed, Elena called her remaining witnesses, a psychologist who had evaluated Diego and diagnosed him with PTSD resulting from his father's murder and the subsequent threats, and a former DEA agent who had worked in Guatemala and could speak to the reach and power of the drug cartels Joaquin Martinez had been investigating. Through it all, Elena maintained her composure, even as Blackwell grew increasingly irritated by her refusal to be intimidated. By the time the final witness was excused, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. "We'll hear closing arguments tomorrow morning," Blackwell announced, gathering his papers. "Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. As everyone rose for the judge's exit, Elena caught Thomas Reed's eye. The government attorney gave her a slight nod, a gesture of professional respect that, under the circumstances, spoke volumes. Once Blackwell had left, Elena turned to Maria and Diego. "You both did wonderfully today," she told them, switching to Spanish. "Diego, I'm so proud of how brave you were, sitting here all day." The boy managed a small smile. "Is it over now? Can we go home?" The innocent question carried such weight. Home, if Blackwell had his way, would mean Guatemala, where danger waited. Not the small apartment in East Los Angeles where Diego had started to feel safe again, where he attended second grade and had made friends, where he was beginning to heal. "Not quite yet," Elena explained gently. "Tomorrow morning Mr. Reed and I will give our final arguments, and then the judge will make his decision." "Will he say yes?" Diego asked, his dark eyes serious. Elena hesitated. "I don't know, Diego, but I promise you, whatever happens tomorrow, I will not stop fighting for you and your mom. Okay?" The boy nodded solemnly, and Elena felt her heart constrict. She had made a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. If Blackwell denied the asylum claim, their options would narrow dramatically. An appeal would take years, during which Maria and Diego would live in constant uncertainty, the threat of deportation hanging over them. As they gathered their belongings, Elena noticed Zoe approaching again. "Ms. Rodriguez," the law student said hesitantly. "I just wanted to say that was amazing, the way you stood up to him in the afternoon session. I've been taking notes. I hope I can be half the attorney you are someday." Elena managed a tired smile. "That's kind of you to say, Zoe. But remember, being an attorney isn't just about what happens in the courtroom. It's about the work you do when no one's watching, the principles you uphold even when it's difficult." "I know," Zoe said earnestly. "That's why I wanted to give you this." She pressed a small USB drive into Elena's hand. "It's the recording from this morning. I know you said you couldn't accept it, but just take it, in case you need it someday." Before Elena could respond, Zoe turned and hurried away, disappearing among the crowd of people exiting the courtroom. Elena stared at the small device in her palm. It was a risk, a breach of protocol. But it was also evidence of what had happened in this courtroom. Evidence that might prove crucial if her case against Blackwell ever went beyond her podcast. She slipped the USB drive into her pocket and escorted Maria and Diego out of the courthouse. After making sure they got safely into their social worker's car, Elena returned to her own vehicle, suddenly exhausted. The strain of maintaining her composure in the face of Blackwell's hostility had taken its toll. As she sat in her car, she pulled out her phone and saw several missed calls from Jordan. She dialed him back immediately. "Elena, finally." Jordan answered. "We need to talk. I've been going through the materials you've gathered on Blackwell, and there's something you need to see. Something big." Elena's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "Not over the phone. Can you come to the studio?" "Tonight. I'll be there in an hour," she promised. 30 minutes later, Elena pulled into the small parking lot behind an unassuming building in a commercial district of Burbank. The sign on the door read Vortex Media Productions, but few people knew that this was the headquarters of the Scales of Injustice podcast. Jordan met her at the door, his lanky frame vibrating with barely contained excitement. At 29, he had the energy and tech, savvy of the digital generation combined with the investigative instincts of an old-school journalist. His father had been a reporter for the Los Angeles Times before budget cuts ended his career. Jordan had inherited his passion for truth-telling but found a new medium for it. "This way," he said, leading Elena through the small reception area to the studio in the back. "I've been digging deeper into Blackwell's cases, like you asked. Looking at patterns, outcomes, anything unusual." In the studio, Jordan's workstation was a chaos of screens, papers, and empty energy drink cans. He cleared a chair for Elena and sat down at his computer. "So, I started by analyzing all of Blackwell's immigration cases over the past 5 years. The denial rate was already suspicious, 94% compared to the national average of around 60%. But then I looked closer at the cases where he actually granted asylum." He pulled up a spreadsheet on one of his monitors. Of the 27 cases where Blackwell granted asylum, 23 were represented by just 2 law firms, Garrison and Winters and Taylor and Associates. Elena frowned. "That is odd. They're both large corporate firms, not typically known for immigration work." "Exactly," Jordan said, his eyes bright with discovery. "So I dug into those firms, and guess what? Garrison and Winters handles legal matters for Westech Development Corporation, while Taylor and Associates represents Pinnacle Investment Group." Elena shook her head, not seeing the connection. "What does that have to do with immigration cases?" Jordan clicked to another screen, pulling up a complex diagram of corporate relationships. Westech and Pinnacle are both major donors to the American Justice Foundation. "And who sits on the board of the AJF?" He clicked again, and a photograph appeared on screen. Judge Richard Blackwell shaking hands with the CEO of Westech at a charity gala. "Holy shit," Elena whispered, leaning closer. "Is granting asylum in cases represented by firms connected to his non-profit work. It gets better." Jordan continued, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I looked into the specific cases he approved. Almost all of them involved highly educated immigrants. Engineers, scientists, medical professionals. People who would be valuable to companies like Westech. He's using asylum as a talent pipeline." Elena realized, the implications hitting her. Denying legitimate cases like the Martinez family while approving ones that benefit his corporate connections. Exactly. And there's something else. Jordan pulled up another document. Last year, the AJF received a $2 million donation from these companies, earmarked for a judicial excellence program that pays for conferences, retreats, and, get this, substantial honorariums to participating judges. That's a conflict of interest, Elena said, her mind racing. Maybe not technically illegal depending on how it was structured, but definitely unethical. It violates judicial conduct standards. "I thought you'd say that," Jordan replied with a grin. "So I kept digging. Tracked the money through 3 different shell companies, and then I found this." He handed her a printout of a bank statement. Blackwell received personal payments totaling over $300,000 in the past 3 years, disguised as consulting fees for a company that doesn't appear to do any actual business. Elena stared at the document, her heart pounding. This isn't just unethical. This is corruption. Actual, criminal corruption. "I verified it from multiple sources," Jordan confirmed. "The connections are real. The payments are real. The pattern of favorable rulings is real." For a moment, Elena was silent, absorbing the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't just about Black's bias or his abuse of power. It was systematic corruption that had affected hundreds of cases, hundreds of lives. "We need to release this," she said finally. "Not just the podcast episode we were planning, all of it. The financial records, the case statistics, everything?" Jordan nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that. I've already prepared a package. The question is, what happens to your case tomorrow? If we release this tonight and Blackwell realizes it's about him, he'd never suspect me," Elena said. "Justice J has been anonymous from the beginning. As far as he knows, I'm just an immigration attorney with a stutter who's annoying him with a case he doesn't care about." But even as she said it, a sliver of doubt crept in. The timing would be suspicious, and if Blackwell made the connection, he could retaliate, not just against her, but against Maria and Diego. "Let's wait," she decided, hating the words even as she spoke them. "Just until tomorrow afternoon after he rules on the Martinez case. Then we release everything." Jordan looked skeptical. "You think he's going to rule in your favor, after what you've described?" "No," Elena admitted. "But I can't risk him punishing my clients because of something I did. They've suffered enough." "Okay," Jordan agreed. "Tomorrow afternoon it is. I'll have everything ready to go with one click." Elena nodded, though the compromise felt like a betrayal of her principles. She was allowing Blackwell one more day to abuse his power, potentially sending Maria and Diego back to a place where their lives were in danger. "Don't beat yourself up," Jordan said, reading her expression. "Tomorrow, Blackwell's career is over. That's something. It won't help the Martinez family if they're already on a plane back to Guatemala," Elena replied quietly. "Then you'd better deliver one hell of a closing argument tomorrow," Jordan said, his tone gentler now. "Make it impossible for him to rule against you even with his bias." Elena smiled wryly. "You have a lot of faith in the power of legal argumentation." "No, I have a lot of faith in you." His words stayed with Elena as she drove home to her small apartment in Echo Park. As she prepared for the next day, reviewing her notes, refining her closing argument, rehearsing potential responses to Blackwell's inevitable interruptions, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads, not just in her career, but in her life. By waiting to expose Blackwell, was she compromising her integrity, or was she making a necessary sacrifice to protect her clients? There were no easy answers, no clear moral path. Around midnight, unable to sleep, Elena opened her laptop and began to record the final piece for the podcast episode. Not as the stuttering, uncertain Elena Rodriguez who had stood in Blackwell's courtroom that morning, but as Justice J, confident, articulate, unwavering. What happens when those entrusted with upholding justice become the very ones who pervert it? She began, her voice steady and resonant. What recourse do we have when the guardians of the law weaponize it against the vulnerable? Today, we expose a system of corruption that strikes at the very heart of our judicial process. The words flowed easily, her voice never faltering. In this role, she was free from the stuttering that had plagued her since childhood, free from the uncertainty that sometimes gripped her in the courtroom. As Justice J, she spoke truth to power without hesitation. When she finished recording, she sent the file to Jordan with a brief message. "Add this to tomorrow's release. Whatever happens in court, the truth needs to be told." Then she closed her laptop, made a cup of chamomile tea, and forced herself to try to sleep. Tomorrow would require all her strength, all her focus, all her conviction. She would stand before Blackwell one final time, not knowing if he was already aware of the sword hanging over his head, not knowing if her own identity as Justice J was still secure. What she did know was that in less than 24 hours everything would change. For Blackwell, for her, and most importantly for Maria and Diego Martinez, whose lives hung in the balance of a system that had already decided they didn't matter. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Elena's last conscious thought was a prayer of sorts. Not to God, but to justice herself, that stern-faced woman with the scales and the blindfold. Let truth outweigh power, just this once. Morning arrived with a pale, hazy sun filtering through the marine layer, typical Los Angeles weather that promised to burn off into brightness by afternoon. Elena woke before her alarm, her mind already racing with the day ahead. She showered quickly, dried her hair, and dressed with particular care. A charcoal gray suit, crisp white blouse, her most professional heels, armor for the battle to come. As she applied her makeup, Elena studied her reflection. At 34, fine lines had begun to appear around her eyes, testament to years of late nights and stress. Her dark hair was streaked with the occasional silver strand that she never bothered to cover. She looked tired but resolute, a woman who had learned the hard cost of fighting for justice and had decided it was worth the price. Her phone chimed with a text from Jordan. Everything ready. Just say the word. Elena stared at the message for a long moment before typing a simple reply, after court. No matter what. The drive to the courthouse felt surreal, as if she were moving through a dream. The familiar streets of Los Angeles, the morning traffic, the courthouse looming ahead. It all seemed both hyperreal and distant, like a movie she was watching rather than a life she was living. In the parking lot, she spotted Maria and Diego already waiting, standing close together near the entrance. Diego was wearing his best clothes, jeans and a button-up shirt that was slightly too large for him, probably borrowed for the occasion. The sight broke Elena's heart a little. Even at 7, he understood the gravity of the day, the importance of appearing good before those who would judge his worthiness to remain in the country he now called home. Good morning. Elena greeted them, summoning a smile. Did you sleep okay? Maria nodded, though the dark circles under her eyes told a different story. Diego's what matters. Elena knelt down to the boy's level. Ready for today, amigo? It won't be too long, I promise. Diego nodded solemnly. I brought Superman again, he whispered, showing her the action figure hidden in his pocket. For luck. Perfect, Elena said, giving his hand a squeeze. Superman always fights for justice, remember? Together, they walked into the courthouse through security and toward courtroom 7B. The hallway was busier today. Elena noticed several reporters hanging around, which was unusual for an immigration case. Had word gotten out about Blackwell's behavior yesterday? Or was it something else? She got her answer as they approached the courtroom doors. A small crowd had gathered, and at its center stood a familiar face. Congressman David Chen, a rising star in California politics known for his advocacy on immigration issues. Ms. Rodriguez, he called out, spotting Elena. A moment of your time. Elena hesitated, then turned to Maria. Go inside and get settled. I'll be right there. As Maria and Diego entered the courtroom, Elena approached the congressman, confusion evident on her face. She had met Chen once at a fundraiser but hardly knew him. Congressman Chen, this is unexpected. He smiled, though his eyes were serious. I heard about what happened in yesterday's proceedings. My office has been monitoring concerning patterns in immigration courts, and Judge Blackwell's name has come up repeatedly. Elena kept her expression neutral, even as her pulse quickened. I'm not sure what you've heard, but I can't discuss an ongoing case. Of course not, Chen agreed smoothly. I'm merely here as an observer today. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, I have a vested interest in ensuring our courts function fairly. The implication was clear. Blackwell was being watched, and not just by Elena. Someone had tipped off Chen about yesterday's proceedings. Zoe, perhaps, or someone else who had witnessed Blackwell's behavior. I appreciate your interest in judicial fairness, Elena said carefully. If you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for today's closing arguments. Chen nodded. Good luck, Ms. Rodriguez. I believe justice has a way of prevailing, even in the most challenging circumstances. As Elena entered the courtroom, she noticed several unfamiliar faces in the gallery. Chen's staffers, presumably along with the reporters who had followed him in. Zoe was there again, sitting in the same spot as yesterday, her notebook ready. Thomas Reed was already at the government's table, looking uncomfortable with the increased attention. And at the defense table, Maria and Diego waited, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. Elena took her place beside them, arranging her materials with steady hands despite the turmoil inside her. The presence of Chen in the press changed the dynamics dramatically. Blackwell would be under scrutiny today, his behavior on display not just to the usual courtroom audience, but to powerful political figures and the media. What's happening? Maria whispered. Why are all these people here? Someone important is watching the case, Elena explained quietly. It might help us. Just be yourself, answer honestly if you're asked any questions, and let me handle the rest. At precisely 900 a.m., the bailiff called out, Rise! The Honorable Judge Richard Blackwell presiding. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and Blackwell entered. He moved with his usual confidence, but as he took his seat and surveyed the crowded courtroom, Elena saw a flicker of surprise, followed by wariness. His gaze lingered on Congressman Chen, recognition and calculation evident in his expression. Be seated. He commanded, his voice giving nothing away. I see we have some distinguished visitors today. Congressman Chen, welcome to my courtroom. Chen nodded respectfully but did not speak. Blackwell turned his attention to the case file before him. We're here to conclude the matter of Martinez et al. Versus Department of Homeland Security. We'll hear closing arguments, and then I'll render my decision. He glanced at Reed. Mr. Reed, you may proceed with the government's closing argument. Reed stood, buttoning his jacket. Thank you, Your Honor. He approached the podium with measured steps. The government's position remains that while the respondent's situation is unfortunate, they have not met the burden of proof required for asylum under the law. The evidence presented does not establish a well-founded fear of persecution on a protected ground. Mrs. Martinez's testimony contained inconsistencies, and the expert witnesses, while knowledgeable, relied heavily on general country conditions rather than specific threats to this family. His argument was professional but notably less aggressive than Elena had expected. He didn't attack Maria's credibility directly or dismiss the expert testimony outright. Instead, he focused on technical legal standards and burden of proof. The book argument that fulfilled his duty as a government attorney, without veering into the kind of harsh rhetoric that might play poorly in front of Congressman Chen and the press. In conclusion, Reed finished. The government respectfully requests that the application for asylum be denied. Thank you. Blackwell nodded. Thank you, Mr. Reed. He turned to Elena, his expression guarded. Rodriguez, your closing argument. Elena rose, feeling a strange calm descend over her. This moment, standing before a hostile judge, fighting for a family's future against overwhelming odds. This was why she had become an attorney. Not for money or prestige, but for moments like this, when words could be the difference between justice and injustice, between safety and danger, between life and death. Thank you, Your Honor. She began, her voice clear and steady. 10 years ago, Joaquin Martinez made a choice that would cost him his life. As a journalist, he chose to expose corruption in his government, to name powerful men who had collaborated with drug cartels, to tell the truth when silence would have been safer. She paused, allowing her gaze to sweep the courtroom, connecting with each juror in the gallery before returning to Blackwell. For that choice, he was murdered. His wife received death threats. His son witnessed violence no child should ever see. And when Maria Martinez sought help from the authorities, she was turned away, not because they couldn't help her, but because they wouldn't, because the same corruption her husband exposed had infected the very institutions meant to protect citizens like her. Elena moved away from the podium, standing closer to Maria and Diego. The law is clear. Asylum must be granted to those who have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of a protected ground, including political opinion and family membership. The evidence we've presented, through expert testimony, through documentation, through Maria's own powerful account, establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that she and Diego meet this standard. She turned back to face Blackwell directly. Your Honor, this case is not just about legal technicalities or immigration statistics. It's about a mother and her son who have already lost so much and who face grave danger if returned to Guatemala. It's about America's promise to be a refuge for those who stand up for truth and justice, even at great personal cost. Elena could feel her momentum building, her words flowing without hesitation. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see Chen leaning forward, reporters scribbling notes, Zoe watching with rapt attention. The government argues that Maria's testimony contained inconsistencies, but those inconsistencies, minor details about dates and times, are exactly what psychologists expect from trauma survivors. They do not undermine her credibility. They confirm the reality of her experience. She gestured to the stack of evidence on the defense table. Our expert witnesses have provided detailed, specific analysis of the threats facing the Martinez family. Dr. Vega's testimony established the pattern of violence against journalists and their families in Guatemala. The psychological evaluation confirmed Diego's PTSD resulting from the trauma he experienced. Former DA agent Harris corroborated the reach and power of the cartels Joaquin Martinez was investigating. Elena paused, gathering herself for the final push. Your Honor, the question before you today is not just whether Maria and Diego Martinez meet the legal standard for asylum, though they clearly do. The question is whether our justice system will protect those who risk everything for the truth, or whether we will send them back to the very danger they fled. She returned to the defense table, placing a hand on Diego's shoulder. Diego was 5 years old when he watched his father bleed to death on their kitchen floor. He is 7 now. In those 2 years he has learned English, made friends, begun to heal from his trauma. He has begun to believe in the possibility of safety, of a future without fear. Elena's voice grew quieter, forcing everyone in the courtroom to lean in to hear her words. Your Honor, I ask you to look at Diego. Really look at him. And then ask yourself, if you deny this asylum claim, if you send this child back to Guatemala, will you be able to sleep at night knowing what awaits him there? The courtroom was utterly silent. Even Blackwell seemed frozen, his usual mask of indifference slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of genuine conflict. The law is on our side. Elena concluded, her voice rising again, strong and clear. The evidence is on our side. Justice is on our side. I ask you respectfully but firmly to grant asylum to Maria and Diego Martinez. Thank you. As Elena returned to her seat, she felt drained yet somehow energized. She had said everything she needed to say, had made the strongest case possible. Now it was in Blackwell's hands. The judge was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he cleared his throat. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. He shuffled the papers before him, seeming to gather his thoughts. This has been an illuminating case. Elena tensed, preparing for his decision, but Blackwell surprised her. Given the complexity of the issues presented and the significant evidence submitted, I'm going to take this matter under advisement. We'll reconvene at 2:00 p.m. for my ruling. He banged his gavel once. Court is in recess. As Blackwell stood to leave, his gaze swept the courtroom, lingering briefly on Congressman Chen before moving to Elena. For just a moment their eyes met, and Elena saw something unexpected, uncertainty, perhaps even fear. Then he was gone, the door to his chambers closing behind him with a decisive click. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as people began to file out. What does that mean? Maria asked anxiously. Is that good or bad? Elena wasn't sure. Blackwell taking time to consider his decision was unusual, especially in cases he seemed predetermined to deny. Was he genuinely weighing the evidence? Or was he simply crafting a more careful denial that would stand up to the scrutiny of Chen and the press? It means he's thinking, Elena said finally, and that's better than an immediate no. As they left the courtroom, Elena was approached by one of the reporters, a young woman with sharp eyes and a recorder in hand. Ms. Rodriguez, Julie Patel from the LA Times. Can I ask you a few questions about this case and Judge Blackwell's handling of it? Elena hesitated. Any public comments could potentially influence Blackwell's decision, for better or worse. I can't discuss the specifics of an ongoing case, she said carefully. But I can tell you that the Martinez family has a strong legal claim for asylum, and I'm hopeful that justice will be served this afternoon. The reporter seemed unsatisfied with the non-answer. Several sources have raised concerns about Judge Blackwell's conduct toward immigrants and attorneys of color in his courtroom. Have you observed any bias in his handling of your cases? The question was a trap. Answer honestly, and she might anger Blackwell before his decision, deflect, and she would be complicit in hiding his misconduct. I believe that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect in our courts, Elena said finally. That includes immigrants, attorneys, and judges. Beyond that, I'll let the court record speak for itself. The reporter opened her mouth to ask another question, but Congressman Chen appeared at Elena's side. Ms. Rodriguez, might I have a word? He asked, effectively cutting off the interview. Grateful for the interruption, Elena excused herself and moved to a quieter corner of the hallway with Chen. Impressive closing argument, he said, his voice low. You've clearly done your homework on Blackwell. Elena gave him a measured look. I prepare thoroughly for all my cases, Congressman. I'm sure you do. Chen smiled slightly. But I wonder if you're aware that there's going to be a rather significant podcast episode released this afternoon, one that details extensive corruption involving Judge Blackwell and certain corporate interests. Elena felt her blood freeze. How did Chen know about the podcast? Had Jordan leaked information? Or was this just a remarkably specific fishing expedition? I can't say I follow many podcasts, she replied carefully. I've been rather busy with my caseload. Chen's smile widened. Of course. Well, let's just say that by this evening, Judge Blackwell may be facing more than just public scrutiny. The House Judiciary Committee has taken an interest in certain patterns of judicial misconduct, and Blackwell's name features prominently in our preliminary investigations. I see, Elena said, struggling to maintain her composure. And you're telling me this because I admire your work, Ms. Rodriguez, both in the courtroom and elsewhere. His emphasis on the last word was subtle but unmistakable. And because I think you should know that whatever Blackwell decides this afternoon, his days of abusing his position are numbered. He handed her a business card. When the dust settles, I'd like to talk to you about some potential reforms we're considering. Your perspective would be valuable. Before Elena could respond, Chen was gone, moving smoothly through the crowd toward his waiting staffers. Elena stood frozen, the business card clutched in her hand. He knows, she thought. Somehow he knows I'm Justice J. The realization was terrifying yet also oddly liberating. Chen hadn't threatened to expose her, he'd offered an alliance. But at what cost? And could she trust a politician, even one whose policies she largely supported? She had no time to dwell on it. Maria and Diego were waiting, their future hanging in the balance. And in just a few hours, Blackwell would deliver his decision, possibly his last significant ruling before the podcast, and Chen's investigation blew his career apart. Elena checked her watch. It was 11:30 a.m. 2.5 hours until Blackwell's decision. 2.5 hours until she gave Jordan the green light to release the podcast. 2.5 hours until everything changed. She took a deep breath and walked back to Maria and Diego, forcing a reassuring smile. "Let's get some lunch," she suggested. "There's a cafe across the street. We should eat something before we come back." As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright Los Angeles day, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to leap into the unknown. Whether she would fly or fall remained to be seen. Inside his chambers, Judge Richard Blackwell paced the length of the room, his judicial robe discarded over a chair, his tie loosened. 30 years on the bench, a sterling reputation, connections in the highest circles of power, and now it was all in jeopardy. He stopped at his desk, glaring at his computer screen. The email had arrived just minutes after he'd recessed the Martinez hearing, sent from an anonymous address to his private judicial account. The subject line was simple: "The truth about West Tech, Pinnacle, and your judicial misconduct." The message contained no text, just a single audio file. He had played it with trembling fingers, and the voice, distorted but unmistakably that of the anonymous podcaster known as Justice J, had laid out exactly what Jordan had discovered: the connection between the law firms, the corporations, the foundation, and Blackwell's rulings, the payments, the corruption. "This evidence will be made public this afternoon," the voice concluded. "But I wanted to give you a chance to do one thing right before your career ends. The Martinez asylum case. You know they meet the legal standard. You know sending them back puts their lives at risk. For once, Judge Blackwell put justice before power. It won't save your reputation, but it might help you sleep at night." Blackwell sank into his chair, running a hand through his silver hair. How had they found out? He'd been so careful, using shell companies, keeping his connection to the foundation at arm's length. And yet somehow this anonymous crusader had pieced it all together. His desk phone buzzed. "Judge Blackwell, there's a Congressman Chen here to see you," his clerk announced. Blackwell closed his eyes briefly. Of course, Chen was on the House Judiciary Committee. If he was here personally, the investigation was already well underway. "Send him in," Blackwell said, straightening his tie and composing his features into a mask of judicial dignity. Chen entered alone, declining the offered seat. "I'll be brief, Judge Blackwell. I'm here as a courtesy to inform you that the committee has received evidence of serious judicial misconduct on your part. We'll be making a formal announcement this evening, after which your cases will be reassigned pending a full investigation." Blackwell's mouth was dry. "What evidence?" Chen's smile was cold. "Financial records, statistical analysis of your rulings, witness testimonies, enough to end your career and potentially lead to criminal charges." "This is absurd," Blackwell blustered, but the protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I've served on this bench with distinction for 3 decades. And in those 3 decades, how many lives have you ruined, Judge? How many families have you torn apart? How many legitimate asylum claims have you denied to maintain your perfect record with your corporate benefactors?" Chen's precision confirmed Blackwell's worst fears. This wasn't a fishing expedition or a political stunt. They knew everything. The Martinez case. Chen continued, his tone slightly softer. "It's legitimate, isn't it? The mother and the boy." Blackwell didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he had known from the beginning that the Martinez case was strong on its merits, but he had also known that denying it would maintain his perfect record with the firms that mattered, the ones connected to his financial arrangements. "The law gives judges discretion," he said finally. "Not to break it?" Chen countered. "Not to violate ethical standards. Not to put personal gain above justice." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You have a chance to do one right thing today, Judge Blackwell. It won't save you from what's coming, but it might save that family. I suggest you take it." After Chen left, Blackwell sat in silence, the walls of his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. 30 years of power, of being the ultimate authority in his courtroom, of deciding fates and futures according to his whims and prejudices, all ending in disgrace. He pulled the Martinez file toward him, opening it with hands that had finally lost their steadiness. Elena Rodriguez's arguments, so passionate and articulate despite his attempts to rattle her. The expert testimony he had dismissed, the evidence he had ignored. The child Diego with his Superman figure and solemn eyes. For the first time in years, perhaps in decades, Judge Richard Blackwell began to read a case file with no agenda other than to understand the truth it contained.